It didn't start with a gunshot or a police raid. It started with a 5-star review. While governments offered millions for his arrest, Christoper Kinahan Sr. was quietly rating restaurants, luxury hotels, and shopping districts online under his own name in cities across the world: Dubai, Istanbul, Barcelona. For decades, Kinahan built power the slow way, through fraud, heroin, prison alliances, and international routes that stretched far beyond Ireland. He survived arrests, feuds, and sanctions. He avoided extradition, and for a long time he stayed invisible, until the internet did what law enforcement couldn't. This is the story of how a Dublin fraudster became one of the most wanted crime bosses in the world, and how, in the end, he helped expose himself. Christoper Vincent Kinahan Sr. was born on the 23rd of March 1957 in Dublin, Ireland. Official records and later reporting place his early life across different parts of the city, including St. Teresa's Gardens in the south inner city and Cabra on the north side. Even his place of birth would later appear inconsistently across documents, with Irish and British passports listing different locations, a small detail that foreshadowed the way identity and paperwork would matter in his adult life. He grew up in what has been described as a middle-class household. His father worked as a dairy farm manager, a steady job that kept the family financially stable. His mother ran a bed and breakfast, a business that required order, presentation, and dealing with strangers on a daily basis. Kinahan was the only son in the family and was raised alongside his sisters in an environment that was not outwardly criminal or chaotic. By most accounts, this was not a household marked by poverty or desperation, but by routine and respectability. Dublin in the 1960s and 1970s, however, was changing. Economic stagnation, unemployment, and the growth of organized crime created parallel worlds within the city. Kinahan came of age as these undercurrents became more visible. By the late 1970s, his name began to appear in criminal records. His earliest convictions involved burglary, handling stolen goods, forgery, and related property crimes. These were not violent offenses, but they required planning, confidence, and an ability to manipulate systems and paperwork. Those early crimes established patterns that would follow him for decades. Court documents and police assessments later noted his calm demeanor, articulate speech, and ability to pass himself off as respectable, sometimes posing as English or upper-class Irish. Even at this stage, Kinahan was not operating as a street brawler or impulsive offender. He was learning how to exploit trust, how to move quietly, and how to profit without drawing immediate attention. By the end of the 1970s, Christoper Kinahan Sr. was already on a trajectory away from petty crime and towards something more organized. The foundation had been laid in these early years, shaped by a stable upbringing, a changing city, and a growing familiarity with fraud and deception that would soon place him deeper inside Dublin's criminal world. By the late 1970s, Christoper Kinahan Sr. had moved beyond opportunistic crime and into something more deliberate. He found his lane in fraud, particularly check fraud, a field that rewarded confidence and precision rather than force. Police records and later reporting describe him as well-spoken and presentable, someone who could sit across a counter and appear legitimate. He often passed himself off as English or upper-class Irish, using accent and manner as tools. The crimes were quiet, but the returns were steady, and they taught him how money moved through systems that assumed honesty. As the years went on, his role expanded. By his late 20s, Kinahan was no longer working alone. He had become a fixer for criminal gangs in Dublin's north inner city, someone who could solve problems, arrange transactions, and smooth over disputes. Fixers survive on trust and discretion, and Kinahan built a reputation for both. He understood paperwork, logistics, and timing. More importantly, he understood people, how to talk to them, how to reassure them, and how to keep his name out of conversations that reached the police. The city around him was changing fast. In the early 1980s, Dublin was hit by a devastating heroin epidemic that tore through working-class neighborhoods. Addiction spread quickly, and so did the demand for supply. Kinahan saw the opening. He moved into drug trafficking as the market expanded. shifting from fraud into narcotics with the same calculated approach he had used before. This was not a sudden leap, but a measured transition into a business that offered scale and power. His rise accelerated after the imprisonment of Larry Dunn, at the time Dublin's dominant drug lord. When Dunn's network collapsed, a vacuum opened at the top of the heroin trade. Kinahan stepped into that space. According to later assessments, he emerged as the city's leading heroin supplier, controlling distribution at a moment when demand was relentless and enforcement struggled to keep up. He lived openly enough to draw attention, residing in a luxury apartment complex in Clontarf and driving a red sports car, symbols that eventually put him on the radar of Garda drug squads. By the mid-1980s, Christoper Kinahan Sr. was no longer a background figure. He had moved from paperwork to poison, from quiet fraud to a trade that left visible damage behind. The fixer had become a supplier, and Dublin was beginning to feel the consequences. By 1986, Christoper Kinahan Sr. had attracted sustained attention from Garda drug squads. His lifestyle in Clontarf, the luxury apartment, the red sports car, and the growing whispers around his role in the heroin trade had made him visible. That year, Gardaí raided his apartment and found a quantity of heroin valued at £117,000, a seizure that placed him firmly in the category of major trafficker rather than peripheral player. The arrest marked the end of his first run on the streets. Kinahan was charged and later sentenced to 6 years in prison for offences connected to the heroin seizure. He was taken into custody at Mountjoy Prison, one of Ireland's most significant holding centres for serious offenders. For law enforcement, the conviction was a clear win. For Kinahan, it became something else entirely, an enforced pause that allowed him to deepen his reach rather than diminish it. Inside Mountjoy, Kinahan began forming relationships that would define the next phase of his career. Prison brought together men from different corners of Ireland's criminal landscape, and Kinahan paid close attention. He observed how others operated, who carried influence, and who had international connections. These were not casual associations. They were strategic, built over shared time, shared grievances, and a shared understanding of how crime survived pressure from the state. Rather than isolating himself, Kinahan used the prison environment as a classroom. He learned how networks functioned beyond Dublin, how drug routes were protected, and how trust was negotiated between criminals who knew betrayal could be fatal. The contacts he made during this period would later reappear in his life once he returned to the outside world, no longer as small-time offenders, but as partners, facilitators, and conduits into wider markets. When Kinahan was released in 1992, he walked out of Mountjoy with more than freedom. He left with a refined sense of structure, patience, and long-term planning. The 6-year sentence had not broken his criminal trajectory. It had reorganized it. The man who stepped back onto Dublin streets was quieter, more disciplined, and better connected than the one who had been arrested in Clontarf. In 1993, Christoper Kinahan Sr. found himself facing familiar legal trouble once again. He was arrested and charged with possession of stolen checks, a return to the kind of fraud that had marked his early criminal years. This time, however, the response was different. Rather than staying to fight the charges, Kinahan was released on bail and made a calculated decision to leave Ireland. He fled to the United Kingdom, effectively placing distance between himself and the Irish courts. That decision coincided with a major shift in how the Irish state approached organised crime. New legislation aimed at dismantling the drug trade led to the creation of the Criminal Assets Bureau, a body designed not to chase street dealers, but to strip traffickers of their wealth. For Kinahan, whose power increasingly rested on money and infrastructure, the threat was clear. Remaining in Ireland meant exposure, moving abroad meant opportunity. He chose Amsterdam. At the time, the city was widely regarded by law enforcement and journalists as a central hub of the international drug market. Operating out of the De Wallen district, Kinahan positioned himself at the heart of the 1990s ecstasy boom. Synthetic drugs were flooding European markets, and Amsterdam provided access to producers, distributors, and transit routes that stretched far beyond Ireland. From there, Kinahan was able to coordinate supply while keeping himself physically removed from the streets he once controlled. His operation was not built alone. In the Netherlands, Kinahan reconnected with John the Colonel Cunningham, an Irish fugitive he had previously known from Mountjoy prison. Cunningham was serving time for the kidnapping of Guinness heiress Jennifer Guinness, a crime that had made him notorious. Kinahan introduced Cunningham to the drug trade, and the two formed a partnership that combined experience, contacts, and shared criminal history. From Amsterdam, Kinahan ran a transnational operation with increasing confidence. His sons, Daniel and Christopher Kinahan Jr., oversaw distribution in Dublin's south inner city, allowing him to maintain influence at home without returning. The arrangement reflected a new model: leadership from a distance, control without visibility. By the mid-1990s, Kinahan was no longer a Dublin-based trafficker. He was becoming an international broker, adapting to pressure by expanding outward rather than retreating. In early 1997, Christoper Kinahan Sr. returned to Dublin for a reason that cut through every calculation he usually made. His father had died, and Kinahan came back to attend the funeral. Irish authorities had been waiting for that moment. He was arrested on outstanding charges connected to stolen travelers' checks, money that had been taken during an armed robbery years earlier. Bail was refused, and this time there would be no quick exit from the country. Kinahan was sentenced to 4 years in prison and transferred to Portlaoise prison, Ireland's main high-security facility. Portlaoise was not Mountjoy. It housed senior criminals, paramilitaries, and men the state considered long-term threats. Kinahan was placed on E1 Landing, an area reserved for what prison staff referred to as the heavies. Above them were members of the INLA and the provisional IRA. The environment was tense, controlled, and deeply political. Inside Portlaoise, Kinahan distinguished himself quickly. Former prison officers later recalled that he kept largely to himself, avoided drugs and prison alcohol, and maintained a disciplined routine. He dressed neatly, studied constantly, and was regarded by other inmates as someone worth listening to. Prisoners sought him out for advice on legal matters, and staff noted his ability to analyze paperwork and procedure with unusual clarity. He became known as a jail lawyer, operating on intellect rather than intimidation. During this sentence, Kinahan committed himself to education. He studied for multiple degrees and learned foreign languages, including Spanish and Dutch, with later accounts also citing Russian. He refused early release in 2001, a decision that surprised prison staff, choosing instead to remain incarcerated until his studies were completed. It was a calculated choice, trading months of freedom for credentials, structure, and focus. It was also during this period that another side of Kinahan emerged. Under the pen name Cian Sharkin, an anagram of his own name, he edited a prison writing anthology titled Pros and Cons. The collection included poetry and short prose written by some of Ireland's most notorious criminals, including convicted killers and paramilitaries. Kinahan himself contributed a short story and a poem, dark pieces centered on fear, control, and authority. The writing group operated under close supervision, but it became another network, quieter than drug routes, yet revealing of how Kinahan observed power and human behavior. By the time he walked out of Portlaoise in 2001, Christoper Kinahan Sr. was no longer defined only by street crime or even by trafficking. He had sharpened his intellect, expanded his linguistic reach, and reinforced relationships with men who operated far beyond Dublin. Prison had not slowed him down, it had recalibrated him. Christoper Kinahan Sr. was released from Portlaoise prison in 2001, having served his full sentence by choice. He did not return to a settled life in Ireland. Instead, he moved quickly back onto the European stage, relocating between countries where he already had contacts, experience, and insulation from Irish law enforcement. By this point, Kinahan had spent more than a decade learning how to operate across borders, and freedom gave him the space to apply it. In the early 2000s, investigators believe Kinahan began positioning himself as a facilitator rather than a hands-on distributor. Intelligence assessments from Ireland and the United Kingdom later concluded that he was involved in establishing cocaine and heroin routes into Western Europe, working with suppliers linked to Latin American cartels and elements of the Russian Mafia. These were not street-level arrangements. They involved shipping, logistics, false documentation, and money movement across multiple jurisdictions. Kinahan's value was not muscle, but coordination. He connected producers, transporters, and markets while keeping himself several steps removed. During this period, he moved fluidly between countries including the Netherlands, Spain, and Belgium. Law enforcement would later state that he had become adept at exploiting differences between legal systems, banking rules, and extradition processes. He also began formalizing parts of his operation through companies and accounts that could absorb and disguise criminal proceeds. The structure was designed to look legitimate, even when the money was not. Between December 2002 and August 2004, UK detectives alleged that Kinahan played a central role in laundering drug profits through a sophisticated horse racing conspiracy. Investigators claimed he helped finance the fixing of 27 races, using insider information and manipulated outcomes to convert criminal cash into apparently clean winnings. The scheme eventually led to criminal charges against high-profile jockeys, including Kieran Fallon, Darren Williams, and Fergal Lynch, who were prosecuted at the Old Bailey. While the case focused publicly on the racing figures, Kinahan was identified by detectives as a financial backer operating behind the scenes. The allegations reinforced a growing view among European police that Kinahan had evolved into a financial strategist for organized crime. He was no longer defined by arrests on the street or seizures in apartments. His role was now upstream, placing money where it could grow, shift, and disappear into legitimate economies. By the end of the decade, he was already regarded as an international operator, one whose name surfaced repeatedly in intelligence briefings, even when charges failed to stick. By 2009, Christoper Kinahan Sr. had completed his transition from Dublin trafficker to transnational crime figure. The infrastructure was in place, the routes were established, and the money was moving. The attention from authorities was intensifying, but so was his ability to stay ahead of it. By 2010, Christoper Kinahan Sr. was firmly established as an international figure rather than a fugitive in motion. Law enforcement pressure followed him across borders. That year, he was awaiting sentencing in Belgium on money laundering charges, a reflection of how his financial activities had drawn the attention of multiple jurisdictions. Around the same period, Spanish police raided properties linked to him, and he spent several months in custody. No charges ultimately stuck in Spain, but the message was clear. Authorities were circling, and Kinahan was now considered a priority target. Rather than retreat, he consolidated. After his release, Kinahan embedded himself on Spain's Costa del Sol, a region long associated with organized crime figures from across Europe. He settled in Estepona, operating from a villa valued at approximately €6 million. From there, he was able to live openly while maintaining distance from the violence and transactions that sustained his organization. The Costa del Sol offered infrastructure, international transport links, and a community where wealth raised fewer questions. From Estepona, Kinahan continued directing large-scale drug trafficking operations that stretched across Europe and beyond. Intelligence assessments described him as overseeing supply routes rather than managing street distribution. Cocaine and heroin shipments moved through networks tied to Latin America, mainland Europe, and the United Kingdom, while money was routed through layered financial structures designed to blunt seizures and prosecutions. His role was managerial and strategic, focused on coordination and protection rather than visibility. During this period, his sons were increasingly active. Daniel Kinahan, who had become involved in boxing promotion, was assessed by law enforcement as running the day-to-day aspects of the organization. The blending of legitimate business, particularly boxing, with criminal influence added another layer of insulation. Investigators later suggested that Daniel was likely the intended target of the 2016 Regency Hotel attack, underscoring how central he had become to the group's operations by the mid-2000s. On a personal level, this era also marked loss. Kinahan's former wife, who continued to live in Dublin, died in 2015. The death closed a chapter tied to his earlier life in Ireland, even as his criminal organization was becoming more entrenched abroad. By the end of 2015, Christoper Kinahan Sr. had successfully anchored himself in southern Spain. Despite arrests, raids, and mounting intelligence files, he remained free, wealthy, and influential. The Costa del Sol had become both his base and his buffer, a place where international crime and everyday luxury existed side by side, and where Kinahan could direct operations that were increasingly global in scale. By late 2015, the conflict that would come to define the public image of the Kinahan organization was already underway. The catalyst was the murder of Gary Hutch in Malaga. Hutch was shot dead in Spain and blamed by the Kinahans for an earlier attempt on the life of Daniel Kinahan. Gary Hutch was not a peripheral figure. He was the nephew of Jerry Hutch, a veteran armed robber from Dublin known as the Monk and a central figure within the Hutch crime group. His killing was taken personally. Attempts to resolve the dispute through intermediaries failed and the lines hardened quickly. The violence escalated almost immediately. On New Year's Eve 2015, gunmen believed to be associated with the Kinahan organization targeted Jerry Hutch at a pub in Lanzarote. The attack failed only because Hutch had already left the premises. The message, however, was unmistakable. The feud had moved beyond threats and was now active across multiple countries. It reached a breaking point on the 5th of February 2016. That afternoon, a boxing weigh-in was taking place at the Regency Hotel in Whitehall, North Dublin, ahead of a high-profile event. A 6-man hit team linked to the Hutch gang entered the hotel. Some were dressed as Gardaí. One was dressed as a woman. Their target, according to Garda assessments, was Daniel Kinahan, who was present in the building. Daniel managed to escape, but the gunman opened fire in the hotel lobby. David Byrne, a senior Kinahan associate and lieutenant, was shot dead. Byrne was 33 years old and a father of 2. His killing unfolded in front of cameras and witnesses, sending shockwaves through Ireland and attracting international attention. The brazenness of the attack marked a turning point. Organized crime violence, usually kept to shadows, had spilled into a public, commercial space in the middle of the day. The Regency Hotel shooting did not end the feud. It intensified it. Retaliatory killings followed in Ireland and abroad. Over the years that followed, at least 18 people were killed as a direct result of the Hutch-Kinahan conflict. Many were relatives, associates, or figures drawn into the orbit of the dispute. The violence prompted a major response from Irish authorities, including increased surveillance, arrests, and legislative pressure. For Christoper Kinahan Sr., the feud altered the operating environment completely. While he remained physically removed from Ireland, law enforcement agencies began treating the Kinahan organization not only as a drug trafficking network, but as a violent criminal enterprise capable of destabilizing public order. The consequences of that shift would shape everything that came next, from international sanctions to forced relocation and sustained global attention. In the aftermath of the Regency Hotel shooting, the pressure on the Kinahan organization intensified sharply. Irish authorities expanded surveillance and investigations, treating the group as a national security concern rather than a conventional drug gang. Arrests followed. Assets were examined, communications were scrutinized. The environment in Ireland had become hostile, unpredictable, and increasingly dangerous for anyone close to the leadership. Staying visible was no longer an option. The response from the Kinahan side was strategic relocation. Operations that had already been partially international were pushed further outward. Spain remained important, particularly the Costa del Sol, but the center of gravity began to shift. The United Kingdom continued to function as a major market and logistical base, especially around the Midlands and northwest England. At the same time, the family embedded itself more deeply in the United Arab Emirates, specifically Dubai, a city whose financial systems, residency structures, and limited extradition arrangements offered protection. By this stage, intelligence assessments from Irish, British, and American agencies increasingly pointed to a change in internal leadership. While Christoper Kinahan Sr. remained a central figure, the day-to-day running of the organization was believed to be passing to his elder son, Daniel Kinahan. Daniel was already well known publicly through his role in professional boxing, operating as a promoter and advisor to high-profile fighters. Privately, law enforcement believed he was managing operational decisions, communications, and enforcement through trusted intermediaries. Dubai became critical to that structure. The city offered a base from which meetings could be held, money could be moved, and international contacts could be maintained with reduced risk of arrest. Multiple companies were established, often presenting as trading, consulting, or business services firms. According to later investigations, these entities were used to launder proceeds from drug trafficking and to mask the movement of funds between Europe, the Middle East, and beyond. Family members and associates were involved in running and fronting these businesses, creating layers of separation between leadership and criminal activity. During this period, the Kinahans were assessed as operating more like a corporate network than a traditional gang. Decision-making was centralized, violence was outsourced or delegated, and financial controls became more sophisticated. Law enforcement later stated that while Ireland represented a shrinking percentage of their direct business, the organization's overall reach and profitability continued to grow, driven largely by the UK market and international supply chains. Between 2016 and 2019, the Kinahan organization adapted under pressure. The violence of the feud had drawn attention, but it also forced evolution. Leadership shifted, geography changed, and the structure hardened. What emerged was a transnational operation with Dubai at its core, Daniel Kinahan at the helm of daily operations, and Christoper Kinahan Sr., operating as the senior figure whose influence was exercised from a distance. By 2022, the Kinahan organization had become impossible for international authorities to ignore. Years of intelligence sharing, financial analysis, and surveillance culminated in a coordinated public strike led by the United States. In April of that year, the US Department of the Treasury, through its Office of Foreign Assets Control, imposed sanctions on Christoper Kinahan Sr., his sons Daniel and Christopher Kinahan Jr., and a network of close associates. Collectively, they were designated as the Kinahan Organized Crime Group, formally placing the family in the same category as the world's most dangerous transnational criminal networks. The sanctions were sweeping. Any property or financial interests linked to the designated individuals within the US financial system were blocked. American citizens and businesses were prohibited from engaging in transactions with them. Assisting the group or helping them evade sanctions carried the risk of severe criminal penalties, including long prison sentences. The aim was not symbolic. It was to cut the organization off from global banking, insurance, shipping, and corporate services that depended, directly or indirectly, on access to US-linked systems. Days later, the pressure intensified. On April 12, 2022, the US Department of State announced rewards of up to $5 million for information leading to the arrest and/or conviction of Christoper Kinahan Sr. and his sons. The rewards were issued under the Narcotics Rewards Programme and coordinated with Ireland's Garda Síochána, the UK's National Crime Agency, and the US Drug Enforcement Administration. Their faces and names were circulated globally, transforming men who had spent years operating quietly into some of the most publicly wanted figures in international organized crime. American officials were blunt about the reasoning. The Kinahan organization was accused of trafficking narcotics and firearms on a global scale, laundering vast sums of money and contributing to violence across multiple countries. Law enforcement agencies also cited intelligence suggesting links between the Kinahan network and other powerful criminal and militant groups, elevating the case from conventional drug enforcement to a matter of international security. For the Kinahans, the sanctions marked a fundamental shift. Life in Dubai had offered comfort and relative insulation, but the designation made everyday business more difficult. Assets were frozen, property sales were blocked, long-standing financial arrangements became liabilities overnight. Associates were forced to reconsider their proximity. The organization was still intact, but it was under open, sustained assault from multiple governments acting in coordination. Christoper Kinahan Sr., long accustomed to staying several steps removed from the spotlight, now found himself at the center of it. His name, once buried in court records and intelligence files, was now on reward posters and government announcements. The world had closed in, not with an arrest, but with something more enduring. A financial siege designed to follow him wherever he went. By 2022, Christoper Kinahan Sr. was sanctioned, named and publicly wanted, yet still physically free. What ultimately exposed his movements was not a leak or an informant, but his own digital trail. Investigative journalists from outlets including the Sunday Times and the investigative group Bellingcat uncovered an extensive record of online activity tied to a Google account operating under the name Christopher Vincent, Kinahan's first and middle names. The account contained hundreds of Google reviews posted over several years. They were ordinary on the surface, comments on restaurants, hotels, shopping districts, and cafes. Taken together, they mapped a lifestyle that contradicted the image of a man in hiding. 5-star hotels, luxury resorts, airline lounges, and fine dining establishments appeared repeatedly. The reviews placed him in Dubai most frequently, but also documented travel through Spain, Turkey, Egypt, Zimbabwe, Hong Kong, and several European cities. Some of the posts were precise. Dates, locations, and photographs accompanied reviews of restaurants in Dubai Marina, City Walk, and Jumeirah. He commented on service quality, presentation, and price. In Istanbul, he described a restaurant as chic and plush. In Dubai, he praised staff as pleasant and helpful and detailed his meals with care. He also reviewed international hotel chains, noting his status as a high-tier rewards member, an indicator of frequent and sustained travel. What turned the reviews from curiosity into confirmation were the images. In several photographs attached to reviews, investigators identified Kinahan's reflection in mirrors, windows, and polished surfaces. One image taken at a restaurant in Dubai Marina in November 2022 showed his face reflected in glass behind the table. Another photo from a hotel bathroom in Barcelona captured him in a mirror. These unintended self-portraits allowed journalists to match facial features with known images of Kinahan and confirm that the account belonged to him. Metadata and travel patterns reinforced the identification. The reviews aligned with known movements, business interests, and previous intelligence assessments. The account also revealed connections, including meetings and locations that suggested ongoing business activity rather than passive exile. While many posts focused on food and comfort, others hinted at broader travel tied to what he described only as business. The findings confirmed what law enforcement already suspected. Kinahan was living openly in Dubai, benefiting from the absence of an extradition treaty with Ireland at the time and the limitations of international enforcement. Despite US sanctions and multi-million-dollar rewards, he remained beyond the reach of arrest. His digital footprint did not lead to handcuffs, but it stripped away any remaining illusion that he had disappeared. By 2024, Christoper Kinahan Sr. was no longer a shadowy figure inferred through intelligence leaks. His movements, preferences, and routines had been reconstructed from his own words and images. He was still a fugitive, but now one whose life could be traced meal by meal, city by city, through the record he left behind himself.